Well, my name is Tori. I am a grateful believer in Jesus. Codependency, anger, unforgiveness first brought me to recovery, but being married to that man keeps me coming back. I'm just joking, kind of. No, this is great. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Pastor John and his entire team. This is a humbling opportunity to share what God has done and what recovery continues to do in my life. You know, John pours into Kevin, which overflows into me and our family, and he's been instrumental in the launch of the Overflow Church Recovery at our church at Overflow, and we're just extremely grateful for him. So, sharing my story was something I had a hard time even considering until God showed me it's not about me. This is his story. It's one of his goodness, his provision, his faithfulness, and he has entrusted me to share it. I grew up in a very loving Christian home. My mother and father unknowingly broke generational curses when they started having children. They both knew they wanted more and different for us. We attended a small church school where women only wore long skirts because women wearing pants was a sin. But we could wear culottes. If y'all know what those are, they are very fashionable. No earrings, tattoos were of the devil, classical music or old hymns were all we were allowed to listen to. And going to the movie theater or a restaurant that served alcohol was forbidden. Mental health or illness was considered a spiritual problem. We had a 6-inch rule in which we had to remain 6 inches from the opposite sex. And the first kiss was to be on our wedding day at the altar in front of God and the church. So to say we were sheltered is an understatement. If you broke this rule, you were ridiculed and blasted from the pulpit. Your family was publicly shamed. And aside from these regulations, we were rarely taught about God's love and his grace and forgiveness. We heard preaching about his wrath, fire, and hell. You became saved out of fear of going to hell. For years, we attended this church with blinders on to the spiritual damage it was doing to our family. I distinctly remember a day our principal told us a story about revival in another church, and it started when one girl in the congregation confessed that if she was hindering revival, she prayed that God would end her life. Well, per the story, that girl did die, and church experienced revival. Our principal began to tell us students we needed to have a heart like that and to ask God to strike us down if we were hindering revival. I remember sitting in class thinking, there's no way that's what God wants from me. Eventually, my brother Josh and I began to talk to our parents about the things we were experiencing and feeling. They listened, and their eyes began to see the indoctrination of the cult-like teachings. After confronting leadership about our concerns, our family was condemned and called apostates and excommunicated from that church. My grandmother and uncle still attend and have not tried to have any contact with us, and that was over 20 years ago. It was harder for my parents to move on because that had been their life. However, they knew we needed to be brought up in a church environment, so we church hopped for a while until we found a church that had a youth group we just fell in love with. I was immersed in the youth group until I finished high school. Like most teens, I began searching for my identity and trying to find my purpose. I started waitressing to help pay for nursing school, and being a people pleaser and being uncomfortable with saying no, I did whatever I needed for people to like me. This led me into a very inappropriate relationship with my married manager. Thankfully, God intervened before anything happened, and my attention was quickly pulled to someone more interesting. If bad boy was a word in the dictionary, his name and picture would be the definition. At the age of 19, I was engulfed by this new world I knew nothing about. He paid me attention out of all the girls, and he chose me. His little jealous remarks were cute and sweet in the beginning. I felt special and wanted. However, it quickly turned to something different. After a night of partying, he got drunk and started calling me every name you can imagine. I was a whore, a slut, and was accused of doing the foulest things to every male member of his family. And mind you, I was a virgin at the time. I was desperate to show him he was the only one for me. I did whatever he asked. He took advantage of that and slowly began cutting everyone out of my life. He accused me of incest, so I quit being with my family. I was accused of cheating with my friends, girls and guys, so I quit hanging out with them. If I ever tried to look or dress nice, he would tell me I was trying to be eye candy for other men and would again be accused of cheating. He would literally rip off a piece of clothing if he knew I felt cute in it. So to reassure him, I quit doing anything to myself just so he knew I was his. He was quickly becoming my drug. As most of these stories go, it's not only verbal and emotional abuse, but it also began to become physical. If I said or did something he didn't like, I was thrown across the room, choked till nearly passing out, slapped, hit, pinned down, and threatened to be beaten to death. No amount of crying or begging would help. it usually only made it worse. And no matter how badly he hurt me, when he would begin to calm down, he would cry and apologize, beg me to stay and crawl on my lap, and would end up being the one comforting him instead of me being comforted. He would apologize and say all the right things, and I prayed he meant it. But of course, nothing changed. After one of the many nights, he would disappear to leave me frantic as to where he was, what he was doing, or who he was with. I showed up to his house to take him to work. Enraged by all my questions, he grabbed the steering wheel and tried to run us into oncoming traffic. I was hysterical by the time we arrived at work. I was screaming for him to get out of my car. He pulled me over the console and shoved my head into the floorboard, choked me to shut me up, pushed me back, threw a drink in my face, and then called me a drama queen for crying. I called my big brother. Him being a police officer at the time, I knew exactly what he would tell me to do. My mom met me, and we went down to the police station and pressed charges. I had the bruises to prove it, and I was covered in the drink he had thrown in my face. I was told he would be questioned and possibly arrested, but would probably be released in a day or so. So over the next month, I slowly began to come out of my shell. I was with my family again and started to hang out with my friends, but then it was time for the court appearance. I was appalled when I saw him come out in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He had been locked up that whole time. He was released that day on probation and court-ordered to anger management classes at my request. And I'm sure you can guess what I did next. I called him that night and told him how sorry I was for everything, and down the cycle we go. I took him to his anger management classes, and I remember him coming out saying how lucky I was that he wasn't as bad as some of the guys in there. And deep down, I began to believe him. Nothing ever really changed. He just added other girls to the mix. The constant cheating, lies, and manipulation had my head so turned upside down, I had no idea what was real and what wasn't. He would move away with this same girl, and he would convince me to come there and see him. He would be arrested and sent to jail again, and I'd help bail him out. I was so addicted to that chaos and the idea of what I thought love was, I had no idea how to break the cycle. If I tried, he would threaten to kill himself, me, or my family. I truly began to feel insane and like I was losing my mind, but like any addict to their drug, I just couldn't stay away. For years, I would survive this cycle of dysfunction. God would eventually intervene and remove him from my life. And even though moving on was one of the hardest things I had to do, I eventually wrote him a letter forgiving him for all he had done to me, and I told him he was no longer mine to carry. I never gave him the letter because it was never for him. It was so my broken soul and heart could finally heal. I had forgiven him, but the damage had been done, and I was an empty shell with no self-worth. I turned to a world I thought brought me happiness. I used my body to get attention. I had sex with hopes of love in return. Clubs, bars, alcohol, men, women. I was truly chasing anything to give me any sense that I mattered. I was seeking validation from anything and anyone. I was disrespectful to my family. I wasn't loyal to my real friends. And I manipulated myself into believing I was being independent and free, when in reality I was bound and hurting. But because of God's faithfulness, I pushed through and graduated nursing school and started to work right after graduation. I took so much pride in my career. I began to put my identity into being a registered nurse. I was out on my own, living a carefree life, but I was empty. And as if meeting guys at bars wasn't enough, insert online dating. My roommate and all her friends convinced me to try Tinder. If you know, you know. After lots of meaningless chats with matches, I was about to delete the app when one night I swiped right and got a match, and all his first message said was 0.08. And that was it. Kevin Carnes was his name, and I was intrigued. He was smooth, funny, edgy, and just plain cute. I found out we were from the same area, and I agreed to finally meet him after a month of chatting. Literally on our first date, he told me there would never be a dull moment, and I was telling him to bring it down a notch. Not much has changed there. We had a whirlwind first month. We both had no idea how to handle any type of conflict. So we broke up, and I turned to my old ways of coping. After a month apart, we went for another try. We were toxic, unhealthy, broken, but inseparable. We fought about everything. He was a broken little abused boy seeking affirmation, needing constant reassurance, and dependent on me for every emotion. And I was a broken-hearted little girl who was hardened, calloused, and angry. So what do? Within 4 months, we got engaged. 5 months later, we were married. By the end of our honeymoon, I was already screaming the word divorce. We fought constantly about everything. It didn't matter. Every dysfunctional habit I had learned from my previous abusive relationship, I dragged into my marriage. I solved fights by yelling, screaming, and name-calling. I knew exactly what to say to make my new husband feel completely belittled and emasculated. So yes, let's add more children to our family. I found out I was pregnant with twins. The pregnancy was difficult from the start, constant morning sickness for the first and second trimester. I started having complications by 28 weeks. We were in and out of the hospital for the next month, trying to keep the boys cooking a little longer. Finally, at 34 weeks, I had an emergency C-section due to a placenta abruption. I was rushed to the OR, prepped for surgery, and then violently started to shake. Kevin was holding down one side, and the anesthesiologist was holding down the other. I remember hearing the two little cries, all the alarms beeping, and feeling the doctor start to stitch me up, and then nothing. Apparently, a lot happened that I was unconscious for. But I woke up in the PACU. The boys were in the NICU, and I was eventually sent to a room. I remember having a hard time breathing and feeling like my heart was racing, so I texted Kevin to come now. He ran to a room that was already full of nurses. I was going into septic shock. Kevin was pushed to the corner, and I remember comforting him and saying, "Let them do their job, baby, I'll be okay." I would receive multiple IV antibiotics and a blood transfusion over the next few days, and then I was discharged home. However, that night, I would again struggle to breathe. I would struggle all night and push myself to go back to the NICU the next morning to see my babies. I couldn't walk due to all the swelling, and I was struggling for every breath. One of the boys' NICU nurses got right in front of me and said, "You're not okay. You have to go to the emergency room. Your boys need you to get better." I knew she was right, so I let Kevin take me downstairs to the ED. I was checked in and immediately taken back for testing. So many unknowns, but I was never worried. I was exhausted and emotional, and I knew I was sick, but I had that peace that made no sense. I spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital being treated for fluid volume overload, pleural effusions, a collapsed lung, and an enlarged heart, all complications from the C-section. But all I cared about was getting home so we could all be together. But little did I know the journey I was about to face. Just 2 months after the boys were born, Kevin would relapse. He would hide his drug use from me for a year. Over that year, I knew something was wrong. I kept finding things that didn't make sense or add up. Money was always going missing, but he always had a valid excuse. We would eventually have to sell our house because we could no longer make the payments. We would move in with my parents, and that's where it all came to light. They began to see things that concerned them. Finally, I caught him yet in another lie and confronted him about it. He admitted he had relapsed, and honestly, I thought it was a joke. How could he have hidden that from me? How did I miss him using drugs? How could he do this to our family? Were we not enough for him? In a second, my world crumbled. I felt as if I was suffocating. I was spiraling. I collapsed under the weight of what I was feeling and literally crawled into the house and just broke. I would discover one lie after another. Kevin was still in denial about the impact of his drug use. He was minimizing the seriousness of the situation, and the lies and the manipulation continued. He would leave to go to rehab just to appease me. I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't know if I even wanted to stay and work it out. He would only stay 2 weeks, convincing me and himself he had it all figured out. Meanwhile, I was being told to move on, to go find a good man. I was encouraged to start dating and find someone who would take care of me and the children. I was told divorce was the only option. I was told he would never change because addicts never change. I was told he was nothing but a liar and he could never be trusted. I was told I meant nothing to him. I was told he'd never loved me or our children. I was told he only married me to supply his addiction. I was told I was weak for staying. I was told I was a fool if I took him back. I was told. I didn't know what to do or how to think, so I took on a new identity. I was a single mother. I was a betrayed wife. I was that abused young teen all over again. Old habits die hard, so after separating, I immediately jumped into a relationship. A quick romance would come to an abrupt stop when given the choice between him or Kevin. I would choose Kevin. My husband was fading away before my eyes, and I knew I had to help him. My parents were furious because he didn't deserve my help. He didn't deserve anything. However, Kevin was willing to go to treatment, so I found a place in Lenore called Bethel Colony of Mercy. I filled out his application. I called and asked what I needed to do. I paid the entry fee. Did I mention I struggled with codependency? Within a week or so, Kevin was accepted. We drove up, I dropped him off, and at first I was hopeful that this would be it. He would be different this time. We tried communicating, but the phone calls were never productive, just yelling and angry arguments. He hurt me, so I chose to hurt him. Again, the chaos would continue. Kevin would relapse soon after coming home. He would sink deeper into his addiction and depression. I was drowning in my own misery, so a year into our separation, I decided to start dating again, to numb the pain, to forget the loneliness. Again, when I had to choose between him or Kevin, I would choose Kevin again. He had started to dabble in harder drugs and ways further away, so I decided to move back in and fix him. But he had no intention of quitting, and I was putting myself and our children in danger at this point, so I left again. The back and forth was too much for my parents to bear, understandably so. So they said I had to make a decision to either get a divorce or move out. They couldn't help me anymore if I was going to continue to help him. So I filed for a divorce. This time I wanted to be better. I begged God to help me change my habits. God has a very funny sense of humor because 4 weeks later I found out I was pregnant. At first I was so angry at God for allowing this to happen. How could he do this to me? He knew I'd be alone. He knew I was struggling with 3 children. How was I supposed to handle 4? But I know now God was determined to get me still. He was protecting me. I begged Kevin to change and be the husband and father we needed, to choose us, but his addiction had its claws dug in deep. I would go through most of my pregnancy angry, bitter, and so lonely. I kept it a secret for as long as I could. I was embarrassed and ashamed. But our sweet Lord, I found out I was having a little girl, and God softened my heart. I began to get excited. God had given me something to be joyful about in the midst of my despair. Tension continued to grow between me and my parents. They were exhausted from the chaos. They were tired of watching me suffer and their innocent grandchildren suffer. They were burnt out from keeping my children every weekend while I worked. They were filled with pain for me and was often misplaced towards me. They would say hurtful things and I would lash right back. It was putting a wedge between us, so at 8 months pregnant, I thought it would be a great idea to move out and get my own apartment. I found a place 2 minutes from Kevin's job. I prayed it would allow us to be together, for it to make it easy for him to see us and be involved. Unfortunately, what I was doing was allowing him a safe, loving place to stay while he remained in his addiction. He came and went as he pleased with no boundaries, saw us when he wanted, and still continued down his own path of destruction. He had all the privileges of having a family with no responsibility. This is enabling. This is codependency. Then God stepped in again. I was working in the ICU caring for a patient. He was not able to interact with me due to the seriousness of his condition, but I'll never forget the day I saw his daughter and son-in-law walk down the hall on their way to visit. I stood up to greet them, gave them a little update on his condition, and immediately this girl had me laughing and so at ease. She walked into the room, and I remember thinking, I haven't laughed like this in a while. I like her. I could be friends with her. I never told anyone at work what I was going through in my personal life, especially my patients and their families. I gave them the fairy tale story of a happy home and marriage. But soon after meeting this woman and her family, there I stood 8 months pregnant, pouring out my whole story to my now dear friends, Anthony and Amanda Bird and Mama Brenda. Strangers that felt safe. Truly a divine appointment, because Amanda told me about her church and a new recovery program they were about to start. She told me to continue to pray for my husband because addicts can and do recover. She prayed over me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. We connected on Facebook, and she sent me her testimony and the testimony of a recovering addict and how God had changed his life. Just maybe my marriage wasn't completely lost. God used that 2-hour window during my shift to change the trajectory of my life and the life of my entire family. Don't tell me my God won't do it. I went on to deliver my beautiful baby girl. Against the advice of so many, I allowed Kevin to be a part of the delivery. I knew I couldn't take that memory away from my daughter, because one of my favorite stories my parents tell me of my birth is how my dad rushed to the hospital and showed up in a 3-piece suit. I wanted her to know her daddy was there. She wasn't abandoned. Again, God gave me the peace that made no sense. The moment they laid her in my arms, I just knew he gave her to me for a reason, and I knew he was going to take care of us. The next few months were still hard. Kevin continued using and filling our life with turmoil, and I continued to allow it to happen. I finally made a boundary that Kevin could only come see us if he could pass a drug test. Well, for months, he didn't see us. Then on Valentine's Day night of 2020, God would radically change my life. Kevin would come banging on our apartment door at midnight, yelling for me to open. I didn't want the neighbors to hear, so I let him in. He stormed through the apartment, searching for a man he had convinced himself was there, tearing into each room, closet, manic to find this illusion he had created in his paranoid, drug-induced mind. He had finally become a man I no longer recognized, and for the first time, I was scared of him. I begged for him to leave, and it wasn't until calling the police he ran out the door. I quickly locked it and ran to check on all my babies. There they slept, so peaceful. I collapsed on the floor and just cried out to God. If Kevin would never change, then he had to change me. He had to fix me. I had no more strength to keep fighting. I was at the end of myself. I was desperate for God to move. I relinquished my control and surrendered my husband to God that night. I had finally started my road to healing. I cut Kevin off completely. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, to cut off the man I knew I loved but could no longer help, to remove the father of my children from their lives, to watch him slowly die in front of me. I had to come to this place. I knew overdose was probable and a suicide was possible, and I had to relinquish all responsibility from it. I no longer held on to the guilt that it was my fault if those things happened. It was no longer mine to carry. During the pandemic, I began to see posts from that little recovery program that Amanda had told me about. I started watching the live stream videos, and I started to understand what recovery was. It had to start with me. I had to work on myself before I could help anyone else. After learning I struggled with codependency, I started to read books on the topic. I started digging into God's Word. I started working through my own issues. I was going to break the chains of addiction off of my family. On May 5th, 2020, I surrendered all alcohol use over to God. After biblical counseling, the Jezebel spirit was broken off of my bloodline in the name of Jesus. I was finally allowing God to transform me from the inside out. Kevin had gone back to treatment at Bethel. Slowly and cautiously, I started to have small conversations with him. I was trusting God's voice instead of the voices around me. Months later, I picked him up from treatment, and we headed to the beach where we spent the next 2 weeks just as lost wanderers. We had the best time just being together as a family. We eventually bought a small house and started digging into our recovery. We were faithful to attend our weekly meetings. Kevin immediately joined a process group, and after seeing huge strides in his recovery, I decided to try one out too. It was painful and liberating all at the same time. Kevin and I were healing as individuals and as a couple. We were having to relearn each other all over again because we weren't the same people from before. There were many times I wanted to throw in the towel, but God's voice spoke to me clearly one night. He said, "You told me you were going to trust me with him, so trust me." God has used this program to mold us into the man and the woman he created us to be, into the husband and the wife he meant for us to be. I have learned that forgiveness is an act of your will, not always an emotion or a feeling. It doesn't erase the memory, but it's a way to release the pain. We have put healthy boundaries in place to keep us accountable to each other and to our recovery. No day is perfect, but Kevin and I have learned to lay our weapons down and stop fighting each other and start fighting for each other. I'm learning to surrender my will daily and step into the calling he has for my life. I'm learning that my identity is in Christ alone, and no man's opinion of me can ever change that. A friend wrote on a verse on my Facebook page yesterday when talking about speaking tonight, and I felt led to share it. It's from 1 Peter 3:15 through 16. Instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. Then if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ. I'm amazed at how God has brought people into our circle when we needed them the most, mentors, sponsors, accountability partners, and friends that have become more like family. We have a whole community of support now. Life is not meant to be done alone. My parents and siblings are now some of our biggest supporters and encouragers. And y'all, that's a miracle. Kevin and I's marriage has been restored to something more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. I have 4 beautiful children that God sent to me because he knew there would be days I needed them more than they ever needed me. Caden is my first baby girl, my bonus baby. You were my constant and my grounding center when I felt everything was spiraling out of control. Your unconditional love for me and the baby saved me more times than you'll ever know. My 4 children are the reason I fight so hard for my marriage, and they are the reason I will keep fighting for the one more. All 12 steps have some important meaning for me. Each step was necessary for my healing and for my continued growth. Giving back and serving others is the best way I can show God how grateful I am for his extravagant love for me. I'm now vocal about what I went through because I know there are power in the words, me too. It's an honor to lead alongside my husband in ministry, as we are now the recovery directors of that small little recovery program where God started it all. Loving the broken intentionally is my calling. God is using my pain for his purpose, and all glory goes to him. Deuteronomy 30, verse 1 through 7, the Message version. And when you come back to God, your God, and obey him with your whole heart and soul according to everything that I command you today, God, your God, will restore everything you lost. He'll have compassion on you. He'll come back and pick up the pieces from all the places you were scattered. No matter how far away you end up, God, your God, will get you out of there and bring you back to the land of your ancestors once possessed. God, your God, will cut away the thick calluses on your heart and your children's heart, freeing you to love God, your God, with your whole heart and soul and live, really live. Thank y'all for letting me share.